It is late. The house is quiet. Maybe you are lying in bed with the covers pulled up to your chin, listening to the soft hum of a fan or the gentle tap of rain against the window. The world outside has slowed down. The phone has stopped buzzing. The last messages of the day have been read, and there is nothing left to do but let the hours drift past like clouds. It is at this hour, when everything is still and the mind begins to wander, that I like to think about the past. Not the loud past of battles and proclamations, but the quiet past, the corners of history where ordinary people went about their ordinary days, most of them forgotten, all of them real. Tonight, I want to take you to a road, a very long road, and I want to introduce you to the people who kept it running, people who opened their doors to strangers, offered them shelter, food, and a soft place to rest out of the wind. The innkeepers of the Persian royal road. Let us settle in first. Find that comfortable spot in your pillow. Let your shoulders drop just a little. Breathe in and breathe out. There is no hurry tonight. No need to remember anything. This is not a lesson with a test at the end. It is simply a story, and stories, like roads, are best traveled slowly. So we will go slowly. We will walk the road together at the pace of an old traveler who has nowhere to be in a hurry, and who knows that the best part of any journey is not the destination, but the people met along the way. I want you to imagine an age long before cars, long before trains, long before airplanes. An age when the world was enormous, not because it was truly bigger, but because getting from one place to another took such a long, long time. For most people, the entire horizon was their village. They knew the fields around them, the river where they drew water, the hill where the wind always blew. A journey of 100 miles was a serious undertaking, a thing of great planning and tremendous courage. A journey of 1,000 miles was almost unthinkable, and yet, somewhere in the ancient world, there came to be a road that stretched across an empire, a road that connected the shimmering coast of the Aegean Sea to the deep, sun-baked plains of Iran. A road so famous that the Greek historian Herodotus wrote about it with wonder. A road that carried kings, ambassadors, merchants, soldiers, and the swiftest messengers the world had ever seen. This was the Persian royal road, and along its entire length, at intervals of a day's journey, there were houses, small fortresses of hospitality, you might call them, rest stops of a sort, and in each one lived an innkeeper, a man whose whole job was to shelter travelers. Now, before we walk through the door of that inn, before we smell the smoke from its hearth and hear the stamping of horses in its stable, let us understand how this road came to be. The Persian Empire was the great empire of its day, the largest the world had seen up to that point. It was founded by Cyrus the Great, who swept across the lands of the ancient Middle East with an army that seemed unstoppable. He conquered the Medes, the Babylonians, the Lydians, and the borders of his kingdom stretched farther than anyone had dared to imagine. But it was not Cyrus who built the royal road. The road, as it is remembered, came from his successor, Darius I, who ruled from about 522 to 486 years before the Common Era. Darius inherited a sprawling empire and understood something very important, something that sounds so simple we might overlook it. An empire is not held together by armies alone. An empire is held together by communication. If the king in his palace at Susa did not know what was happening in the distant province of Lydia, if orders took months to arrive, if taxes were collectible only when the collector happened to pass through town, then the empire was not truly an empire. It was just a collection of places that happened to share a border. So Darius built a road. But let us not think of it the way we might think of a modern highway. There was no asphalt, no smooth concrete, no painted lines. The royal road was a route, a way that had been established and improved, carefully maintained, so that it could be traveled year after year. In some places, it followed older tracks that had existed since the days of the Assyrians. In others, it was laid out fresh, with bridges over rivers and stones placed in the marshy ground so that wagons would not sink. Ancient writers tell us that the road ran from Sardis, a wealthy city on the western coast of what is now Turkey, all the way to Susa, one of the great capital cities of the Persian Empire, deep in what is now Iran. That is a distance of roughly 1,600 miles, or something like 2,500 kilometers. Let that sink in for a moment. Imagine walking from New York City to Denver, or from London to Baghdad. That was the distance. And along all of that distance, the road was divided into stages, like the chapters of a book. Herodotus, who lived in the 5th century before the Common Era, wrote that there were 111 stations along the road, spaced about a day's travel apart, each with a royal inn. 111. That is a number worth resting on, a number that tells us exactly how much the Persians had committed to the idea of the journey. So now, let us put ourselves on that road. Let us choose an afternoon, the kind of afternoon that comes in early autumn, when the sun is still warm, but the air has a bite in the shade. We have been traveling for several days. We are not royalty, but we are not prisoners either. Perhaps we are a merchant, carrying bolts of dyed wool from the workshops of Sardis to trade in the eastern cities. Perhaps we are a scribe, sent by a governor to deliver a letter to the court at Susa. Perhaps, and this is a nice thought, we are simply a traveler, someone who has been given permission by the king's authority to use the road, with a sealed tablet that marks us as a person of legitimate business. The road stretches ahead of us, and it is not a lonely strip of dirt. It is a busy place. We pass farmers taking their grain to market. We pass soldiers marching in the other direction, their shields wrapped in cloth to keep the dust off. We pass donkey caravans loaded with bales of goods, their drivers calling to one another in languages we do not fully understand. The road is alive. It is the bloodstream of the empire. As the afternoon wears on, our legs grow heavy, and our eyes begin to search the horizon for a certain kind of shape. We are looking for the station, the rest house that Herodotus would have called a stathmos. And there it is, rising from the flat ground, a low, solid building made of stone and mud brick, with a flat roof and walls that have been whitewashed to reflect the sun. It looks, from a distance, more like a small fortress than a hotel. The windows are high and narrow. The entrance is a single heavy wooden door, reinforced with iron bands. But there is smoke curling from the chimney, and that smoke tells us a beautiful thing. There is a fire inside. There will be food. There will be warmth. We approach the door, and by now, the sky has begun to turn the color of peach and honey. The evening air settles around us, and we hear sounds from within the building. The clatter of pottery, the low murmur of voices, the sudden, cheerful snort of a horse from the stable around the back. We lift our hand and knock, and after a moment, the door swings open, and there stands the innkeeper. How do we picture him? He was probably a man of middle age, chosen for this position because he was trustworthy. He might have been Persian himself, one of the many officials appointed by the king, but he also might have been a local, someone who knew the landscape and its dangers, someone who could be relied upon to keep the station running. He wore a simple tunic, perhaps belted at the waist, and in the cooler months, he would have added a woolen cloak. His hands were rough from hauling firewood and grain and water, but there was kindness in his face. At least, let us hope there was kindness, because the innkeeper of the Royal Road had an enormous responsibility. He was not just a man who rented out rooms. He was the warden of a royal facility, and the success of the entire road depended on his careful management of supplies, animals, and people. He looks at us, assessing us in a single glance, noticing that we are tired, noticing that our shoes are dusty, noticing that we are alone and unarmed, and therefore not a threat. He steps aside and beckons us in. And what a warm welcome it is. The main room of the inn is large and low-ceilinged, with wooden beams supporting the roof, and a great hearth set into the far wall. The fire crackles and pops, throwing golden light across the faces of the other travelers who are already there. They sit on low benches or on thick carpets spread over the floor, eating from clay bowls and sipping from cups of wine. One man looks up and nods at us. Another raises his cup in a silent greeting. The innkeeper leads us to an empty spot near the fire and gestures for us to sit. There is something deeply comforting about this moment. We have spent all day on the road, braced against the wind, watching our feet on the uneven ground, carrying our belongings on our backs, or on a mule that is now being cared for in the stable. We have been on our own, exposed to the sky, reliant on our own two legs. And now, all at once, that tension dissolves. The heat of the fire reaches into our bones. The sound of other voices wraps around us like a blanket. We are no longer alone. We are sheltered. And after a long day, there is no feeling in the world quite like that. The innkeeper brings us something to drink. It is not wine, not yet. First, he brings us a small cup of barley beer, a thick, nourishing drink that was common in the ancient world, or perhaps a cool pitcher of water with a trace of mint in it. We drink, and the dryness in our throat eases. Then he brings us food. There is a stew made of lamb and onions and lentils, seasoned with cumin and garlic, all simmered together in a great iron pot that hangs over the fire. There is flat bread, warm and dusty with flour, torn into pieces for dipping. There is cheese and dried figs, and dates like little lumps of honey. We eat slowly, savoring each mouthful, and as we eat, we look around the room and listen to the conversations that drift past our ears. Travelers are the world's greatest storytellers. They bring news from the places they have seen. Tonight, there is a messenger who has come from the west, and he tells the others about a ship that was wrecked off the coast of Cilicia, and a rumor that the Greek city-states are arguing among themselves again. A merchant from Babylon mentions that the river levels were low this year, which means the harvest may be poor. An old soldier, traveling east to rejoin his garrison, speaks of a mountain pass that was closed by snow earlier than expected. We sit and listen, and the fire crackles, and the world outside becomes less and less important with every passing minute. But we must understand that the inn was not only a place for food and rest. It was a crucial piece of the Persian communication network. This is where the story of the innkeeper becomes truly remarkable. Imagine the pressure of running a place where the most important travelers in the world might arrive at any hour. The Persian kings had a system of mounted couriers, riders who were trained to carry messages across the empire at astonishing speed. These couriers did not ride the entire distance. They went from station to station, fresh horse to fresh horse, almost like a human relay race. One courier would gallop into the station, disheveled and exhausted, his horse frothing with sweat. And at the same moment, another courier would be ready at the stable door, already mounted, already holding his own message pouch, waiting for the word to go. The innkeeper had to make sure that the fresh horse was there, saddled, fed, and ready. He had to make sure that the rider had enough food and water to sustain him on the next stage. He had to move quickly, efficiently, without panic, because a delay of even an hour could be the difference between a message arriving in time and arriving too late. Herodotus wrote that these couriers were the fastest people on earth, traveling a distance that would take a normal man 90 days in about 7 days. He described them in a passage that has become famous, saying that there is nothing in the world that travels faster than these Persian couriers. Some of you, I think, have heard a version of his words because they were adapted and inscribed on a post office building in New York City many centuries later. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. That was originally a description of the Persian couriers, and it carries a quiet, steady heroism that we can still feel today. When the snow was falling thick and the wind howled across the empty plain, the courier rode. When the sun burned down and the dust clogged his throat, the courier rode. When night fell and the road disappeared into darkness, the courier rode, guided by the lights of the stations that appeared at regular intervals along the way. And every time he arrived, the innkeeper was there. Think about that innkeeper for a moment. He had to be ready at all hours. He slept, of course, but perhaps not deeply. An inn on the royal road was never truly silent. There was always something happening. A late arrival would pound on the door. A courier would need a fresh horse at midnight. A traveling noble would require food, and a room at an hour when everyone else was asleep. The innkeeper learned to live in a state of alert readiness, like a sailor who can sleep through the creaking of the ship, but wakes instantly when the creaking stops. He was the anchor of the station, the steady presence who made the impossible speed of the couriers possible in the first place. But the innkeeper was not alone in his duties. The station was a small community. He probably had assistants, maybe slaves or servants from the local village, who helped with the cooking, the cleaning, the care of the animals. There was someone who fetched water from the well, someone who ground the grain for bread, someone who mended the saddles and bridles that were used so hard and so often. The innkeeper of the Persian royal road was really more of a manager, the head of a household that served the entire empire. And while his station was one of 111, each one was essential. If one station failed, if the innkeeper let the supplies run out, if the horses were neglected, if the roof leaked and the beds grew damp, then the whole road stuttered. Let us spend a little more time inside this inn, because there is a particular beauty in the details. The room where we are sitting, the common room, is not glamorous by any standard. The floor is packed earth or unpolished stone, covered here and there with worn carpets. The walls are plastered, and in some places we can see marks left by years of smoke from the hearth. There are no windows, or only one high slit, because the wind blows cold at night. The light comes from the fire and from oil lamps set on ledges along the walls. The furniture is simple, chairs and benches made by local carpenters, rough but sturdy. And yet, the inn manages to feel welcoming because of all the small signs of care. The bread is warm, the water is clean, the firewood is dry. The innkeeper has done his job well, and the proof is in the comfort that surrounds us. When we are finished eating, we ask about a place to sleep. The innkeeper leads us down a narrow corridor to a small room, or perhaps he points to a section of the common floor where we can spread our own blanket. In an ancient inn, privacy was rare. Travelers often slept side by side in the same large room, sometimes in the same room where they had eaten, rolling themselves in blankets and setting their heads on a bundle of clothes. Only the most honored guests, an ambassador or a general, might be given a private chamber. But for most of us, the sleeping arrangement is communal, and there is a strange, quiet sweetness in that shared vulnerability. We are all strangers here. We are all far from home. But for one night, we lie on the floor of a warm inn, listening to the breathing of 20 other people, and we belong to one another in a small and gentle way. The innkeeper makes sure everyone is settled. He walks among the sleepers, checking that the fire is banked, that the doors are barred, that the animals in the stable are content. Perhaps he hums a song that he learned as a child, a lullaby in a language half forgotten. He stops for a moment at the doorway and looks out at the sky, where the stars have come out like 1,000 cold lamps. The road outside is silver in the moonlight, stretching away toward the next station, where another innkeeper is doing the same thing, checking the fire, barring the door, looking up at the same stars. There is a chain of care connecting them, each innkeeper a link in a great chain that spans the empire. And when we close our eyes, we can feel ourselves held within that chain, safe, unalone. Now, let us ease our minds back a little further and think about the bigger picture. The royal road was not just an engineering project. It was a way of making the empire feel smaller, a way of drawing the distant provinces closer to the king's attention. Before the road, a message from Sardis to Susa might take months, arriving so late that news was barely news anymore. After the road, with its relays and its stations and its tireless innkeepers, messages could cross the empire in a week or two. A king in Susa could send an order to a governor in Lydia and reasonably expect to receive a reply before the season turned. This was a revolution in government, a transformation that changed the way the ancient world understood power. And at the heart of that revolution was the humble station, the inn, the place where a rider changed horses and grabbed a quick meal. We rarely think of the people who make speed possible, but they deserve our attention. The innkeeper was one of them. Let us also remember that the innkeeper was not merely a servant. He held a position of authority. In the Persian Empire, the stations were royal establishments, funded by the king and managed under his authority. The innkeeper was likely given a grant of land to support himself and his household, and the supplies for the station, the grain for the horses, the flour and oil and wine for the travelers, came from the royal stores. He answered to the local governor, and the governor answered to the king. To be an innkeeper on the royal road was to hold a responsibility that the king himself cared about. It was an honor, a burden, and a quiet kind of power. Travelers depended on him. Couriers depended on him. Even the king, far away in his palace garden, depended on the innkeeper to keep the road alive. And what of the travelers themselves? We have already imagined a merchant, a scribe, a soldier. But the royal road carried many kinds of people, and the innkeeper met them all. There were ambassadors from foreign kingdoms, sent to negotiate treaties or offer gifts to the Persian king. There were Greek philosophers, traveling east to learn from the wise men of Babylon and Persia. There were doctors, engineers, artists, musicians, all moving along the road for the business of the empire. There were also travelers on religious pilgrimages, visiting sacred sites that had been old for centuries before the road was built. And there were, of course, the king's own messengers and officials, moving back and forth with the constant hum of administration. The innkeeper learned to read people. He could tell from a traveler's clothes, from his shoes, from the way he walked, whether he was a man of importance or a man of modest means. He treated them all according to a protocol, with respect to the powerful, with kindness to the humble, and with a careful eye to everyone. There is a story I like to imagine. It is not found in any ancient text, as far as I know, but it feels true. on a cold winter night, when rain is lashing the walls of the station and the road has turned to mud, the innkeeper hears a knock at the door. He opens it, expecting a courier or a soldier, but instead he finds a young woman, soaked through, shivering, holding the reins of a limping donkey. She has been traveling alone, which is strange and perhaps dangerous, but she has a letter from a distant relative who holds some office, and she is trying to reach the city where he lives. The innkeeper looks at her, hesitates for only a moment, and then steps aside to let her in. He gives her his own place near the fire. He brings her hot soup and a blanket. He does not ask too many questions. He knows that the road is hard, that not every traveler has a secure home waiting for them, and that the inn is a place of refuge, not a place of judgment. By morning, the rain has stopped. The donkey is rested. The young woman continues on her way, and she tells the story of the kind innkeeper for the rest of her life. Perhaps it happened exactly that way. Perhaps it did not. But it is the kind of thing that the innkeepers of the royal road might have done, because their calling was, at its heart, a calling of hospitality. We are about halfway through our evening's journey, I think. The fire in our imaginary inn is burning low, and the voices around us have faded to a gentle murmur. So let us take this natural pause, this soft moment of silence, to let the image settle in our minds. The Persian royal road, stretching across a continent, marked at regular intervals by stations built of stone and mud. The innkeeper standing at his door, watching the horizon. The travelers arriving one by one, each with a story, each with a weariness that only rest can cure. The horses in the stable, stamping softly in the hay. The bread in the oven, the stew in the pot, the wine in the jug. These are the small details that made up the great miracle of ancient communication. And as we rest here, between the past and the present, between the world of Persia and the world of our own beds, we can feel a connection to that long ago time. Let us wander a little more before we sleep. Let us think about the difficulty of the job. The innkeeper's life was not always cozy. The road could be dangerous. Bandits lurked in the hills, and though the Persians worked hard to keep the route safe, there were times when a station was attacked. An innkeeper might wake in the night to the sound of shouts and the clash of weapons, and he would have to protect his guests, his family, and his supplies. He might have to hide travelers behind a false wall or in a storage room. He might have to bargain with raiders, offering them food and drink in the hope that they would leave without violence. The Persians were not naive about the risks, and they posted garrisons at strategic points along the road. But the innkeeper still lived with a measure of danger. It was a hidden cost of the job, a weight that he carried alongside the flour and the firewood. There were also smaller, more ordinary challenges. The weather. In the high passes of Anatolia, the winter snow could be deep enough to block the road for weeks. The innkeeper had to stockpile enough food and fuel to survive a long siege of snow, and he had to keep the station clear enough for travelers to find their way through the drifts. In the lowlands of Mesopotamia, the summer heat was so fierce that travel was sometimes done at night, and the innkeeper would see travelers arriving at dawn, their faces pale with exhaustion, desperate for shade and water. He kept the cisterns full and the floors damp to cool the rooms, and he learned to move through the heat without wasting his energy. The innkeeper was at the mercy of the land, but he adapted, bending to the seasons and always providing a place of refuge. And what about the horses? They deserve a mention. The couriers of the royal road could not have done their work without fresh mounts at each station, and the innkeeper was responsible for these animals. He had to ensure that each horse was well fed, well shod, and strong enough for the next stage. When a courier arrived on a lathering horse, the innkeeper or his grooms would take the exhausted animal, walk it slowly to cool it down, rub it down with straw, and give it water. Meanwhile, a fresh horse would be brought from the stable, already bridled, eager to run. The horses were cherished. They were the engines of the empire, and the innkeeper cared for them with the same attention he gave his most important guests. Sometimes he would have to turn away a traveler who needed a new horse because the horses were reserved for the royal couriers. That must have been a difficult conversation, and I imagine the innkeeper developed a gentle way of refusing, a way that softened the disappointment with the offer of food and a comfortable corner by the fire. In many ways, the innkeeper stood at the junction of two worlds. There was the grand world of the empire, with its kings and generals and urgent messages. And there was the intimate world of the hearth, with its stew bubbling and its tired guests settling down to sleep. The innkeeper served both worlds. He translated the vast ambitions of the empire into the small, warm language of shelter and care. He made the abstract idea of the road into a place where a stranger could find a meal. This is a quiet heroism, the kind that does not appear in stone carvings or royal chronicles. But it is the kind of heroism that truly holds a civilization together. Let us think for a moment about the word shelter. It is such a simple word, but it contains so much. Shelter means a roof over our heads. It means walls that keep out the wind. It means warmth when the night is cold, food when our belly is empty, company when we are lonely. The Persian royal road innkeepers provided all of these things, and in doing so, they did something more. They provided a sense that the world was safe enough to travel, that the distance between home and home was not an unbridgeable gap, that a person could cross half the world and still find, at the end of a long day, a door that opened to them. When we think about the great wonders of the ancient world, we think of pyramids and ziggurats, of hanging gardens and colossal statues. But perhaps the greatest wonder of all was smaller, quieter, more numerous. It was the network of inns, the chain of doors that opened along the royal road, the shelter that made the enormous world feel human. I wonder if you, in your own life, have ever relied on the hospitality of strangers. Perhaps you have been on a long trip, delayed and tired, and found a place to rest that felt like a small miracle. Perhaps you have stood at a door at night and been welcomed in from the cold. That feeling, that gratefulness, is as old as human time. It is the same feeling that a Persian traveler had 3,000 years ago when the innkeeper opened the door and pointed to a spot by the fire. We are connected to those old travelers by this universal thread. When we hear their story, we are hearing our own story, told in the dust of another age. Now, let us walk back outside, just for a moment, before we settle down for good. The inn is behind us, its windows glowing faintly with the embers of the fire. The road stretches before us in the darkness, a pale ribbon that curves over the hills and disappears into the trees. The moon is out, or perhaps it is hidden behind a veil of clouds. It does not matter. We know that somewhere along the road, dozens of miles away, there is another station and another innkeeper, and that he is just now pouring a cup of wine for a weary traveler who has come in out of the dark. And beyond that station, another. And beyond that, another. 111 lights, strung across the landscape like a necklace of stars, each one attended by a keeper who has made the simple promise to be there, to be awake, to open the door. We are standing between two of those lights, equidistant from here and there, suspended in the stillness of the ancient night. The Persians had a concept that they called paradise, a word that originally meant an enclosed park or garden, a walled place of coolness and beauty in the midst of the wild. The royal stations with their courtyards and their gardens, their shaded wells and their fruit trees, might have seemed like small paradises to the travelers who reached them after days on the road. The innkeeper was the keeper of that small paradise, the one who tended the garden and welcomed the weary. If we carry anything away from this story, let it be this image: a garden at the edge of a dusty road, a gate opening to a courtyard, a man with a quiet face offering water from the well, and the traveler stepping inside, feeling the world ease around him. That is the story of the Persian royal road. That is the gift of the innkeepers. They turned miles into places and places into welcome. So let us leave them now, those old innkeepers, and return gently to our own beds. The journey has been long tonight, but a good sort of long, the long of a winding path through a meadow rather than a steep path up a mountain. We have walked the royal road. We have sat by the fire in the low-ceilinged room. We have heard the couriers ride in and out, the clatter of hooves fading into the dark. We have felt the weight of the blanket and the warmth of the stew. And now we can rest, knowing that the chain of care that held the ancient road together is, in its own way, still present in the world. Every time someone opens their door to a stranger, every time we find shelter on a difficult night, we are living the old story. We are travelers on the royal road, and there is always an inn ahead. Sleep well when you are ready. Let the road fade away into the gentle dark. The couriers have passed, the fire is low, and the innkeeper has at last closed the door for the night. There is nothing more to do, nowhere else to be. Only rest and the quiet breathing of the ancient road beneath the stars. Good night, traveler, good night. And yet, just as you are beginning to settle into that warm forgetfulness, perhaps the innkeeper is doing one last thing. He has closed the door, yes, but he has not yet gone to his own bed. He stands in the courtyard with his lamp raised, making sure the gate is latched and the well cover is in place, listening to the sound of the stable, where a sleepy groom murmurs to the horses. The lamp moves slowly, a floating circle of light, and we follow it. This, I think, is the part of the night that belongs only to the innkeeper. During the day, he is for the travelers, a man with a jug of water and a steady hand. But in the small hours, with the last guest asleep and the fire lowered, he becomes something else. He becomes a guardian. He walks the perimeter of his little kingdom, the walls that hold back the dark. He checks the bolt on the storeroom door. He runs his hand along the wooden beam that supports the eave. He pauses by the gate and listens to the road, and the road says nothing, and that is good. Perhaps there is a quiet pleasure in this ritual. The innkeeper knows his domain better than anyone. He knows which stone in the courtyard holds the heat of the sun late into the night. He knows which shutter creaks when the wind turns north. He knows the sound of a tired traveler's step, the difference between a knock that asks for help and a knock that has come home. All of this knowledge is in his hands as he walks, a kind of second sight. He makes his way back to the stable. The horses are lying down now, their legs folded beneath them like great slow dogs. The grooms, too, are asleep in the corner, wrapped in blankets, their feet almost touching the embers of a charcoal brazier. The innkeeper does not wake them. The morning will come early enough, and they have done their work well. He only breathes in the warm smell of hay and horse and sweat, and breathes it out again. And then, at last, he climbs the narrow stairs to his own chamber. The room is small, plain, a place of rest rather than ornament, a bed of woolen blankets on a low frame, a wooden chest with his few possessions, a peg on the wall where his outer garment hangs. But the window looks out over the road, and even when the shutter is closed, the innkeeper can hear the changes in the wind. He lies down, and he does not immediately sleep. His body is still humming with the long day, the movement, the noise, the demands of 100 small decisions. He lets the humming settle. He listens to the rafters creak softly above him, and somewhere deep in the earth below the floor, he can almost feel the weight of the ancient dust, the dust of all the feet that have passed this way before his time. When we think of the innkeepers of the royal road, we think of them in the service of the travelers. But they were also servants of the road itself. They kept the road alive in a way that the stones and the markers could not. A road is only a scratch on the earth unless someone remembers it, walks it, sweeps it, builds beside it. The innkeeper was the memory of the road. He saw it change with the seasons. He watched the grass push through the wheel ruts and then get trampled down again. He observed the way the rain reshaped the edges of the road, the way a fallen tree might block it for a time, the way the king's engineers would come and set it right. And in this daily attention, the innkeeper performed a kind of devotion. There is an old saying that the guest is a gift to the house. I like this saying because it inverts our usual idea of hospitality. We think that the host gives the gift, the shelter, the meal, but the saying suggests that the guest is the gift. the one who brings the news of the wide world into the quiet house, the one who carries the stories onward. The innkeeper, in this view, is the receiver. He opens the door, and the world enters. Consider the variety of those who entered. It is easy to imagine that the royal road was used only by kings and couriers, but that is far from the truth. The road was a highway of ordinary life. There were merchants, certainly, with their long trains of donkeys and mules loaded with textiles, spices, and tools. There were priests on pilgrimage to sacred shrines. There were musicians and actors drifting from town to town, carrying songs that would soon be changed by the next valley and the next language. There were iron workers and carpenters, sailors who had left the coast and were making their way inland, farmers going to sell their grain at the provincial capital. There were families, mother and father and children, moving to a new village to join relatives. There were even prisoners, sometimes under guard, not welcome at the inn, but allowed to sit outside with a bit of bread. Each of these people brought their own small economy into the innkeeper's world. They spent their coins or bartered their skills. A traveling cobbler might repair the innkeeper's worn boots in exchange for a meal. A porter with strong shoulders might carry a load of firewood from the woodpile to the kitchen. A woman who was handy with a needle might mend the innkeeper's patched cloak. In this way, the inn was not a separate place that served the world. The inn was the world, compressed into one courtyard, everything exchanging with everything else. There is a particular morning that I like to imagine. The innkeeper, because he has slept only a few hours, is awake before the first light. This is his habit, and he does not fight it. He rises in the darkness, his hands finding the things he needs without the help of his eyes. He goes down to the kitchen, where last night's embers are still white and warm in the hearth. He blows them into a small flame, adds a little kindling, and sets the water to boil while he mixes the dough for bread. The bread of the road. I wonder if we can smell it from here in our own faraway time. It would have been a simple bread, made of wheat or barley flour, water, a pinch of salt, perhaps a sprinkle of cumin or coriander seeds, if the innkeeper was a man of ambition. The dough was kneaded in a deep wooden bowl that had been worn smooth by the touch of many hands, and then it was pressed flat and laid directly on the hot stones of the hearth. The smell of baking bread rising in the dark kitchen was the smell of safety itself. It was the promise that the world was still turning. That morning would come, that there would be food and warmth. By the time the first traveler emerged from the sleeping room, scratching his beard and blinking in the smoky light, the innkeeper was ready. He poured a cup of soured milk or watered wine, set out the bread, still hot, next to a little dish of olive oil, and a handful of olives from the tree in the courtyard. He might add some soft white cheese and a few dried figs. Nothing opulent, nothing that would weigh down a man for the road ahead, but enough, always enough. And here the innkeeper's craft showed itself. He had to guess, each morning, how much food to prepare. Too little, and the travelers would go hungry and unreliable. Too much, and the waste would do harm to his meager accounting. he learned to read the road. A knob of dust in the air meant a caravan was approaching. A deep quiet meant a day of solitude when he could mend the roof and count his stores. The road was like a living thing, breathing travelers out and drawing them back. The innkeeper learned its pulse. I should say a word about the food of the road, because it was one of the great practical arts of the ancient world. The innkeeper's larder had to be understood in terms of what could be preserved and what could not. The innkeeper's larder had to be understood in terms of what could be preserved and what could not. The Persian kitchen was a study in patience, a quiet science of salt and smoke and shade. Wheat and barley could be kept for a year or more if they were stored in deep clay jars with tight lids, raised off the floor on little stone feet so that the damp would not creep in. Lentils and chickpeas dried hard as pebbles and would keep almost indefinitely, waiting in their sacks like sleeping things, content to be still until the cook summoned them back to life in a pot of simmering water. Dried figs and dates, pressed into cakes and packed with nuts, were sweet enough to survive long journeys in a saddlebag, and rich enough to restore a man's spirits when the road had worn him thin. Olive oil was stored in great amphorae, dark and cool in the cellar, and the innkeeper had to learn the particular voice of each jar, the way the oil sounded when it was poured, the way its color changed from green gold to pale gold as it aged. Vinegar, too, was a patient companion. Wine that had turned sharp was not wasted. It became another kind of treasure, a bright acid that could lift a bowl of lentils or refresh a tired throat. And there was always honey. The honey of Persia was famous, thick and fragrant with mountain flowers, and it was the innkeeper's secret weapon. A jar of honey could sweeten anything, soothe a child's cough, dress a wound in a pinch, or make a plain cake taste like a celebration. The larder, then, was a place of layered time. Some foods were young, just brought in from the market that morning. Others were old, mellowing in the dark, waiting for their moment. The innkeeper knew each one the way a shepherd knows his sheep, and he doled them out with a careful hand. There is a kind of peace in that sort of accounting. To know exactly how many jars of grain stand on the shelf, how many strings of dried onions hang from the beam, how many rounds of cheese rest in the cool niche behind the stairs. The innkeeper did not count these things with anxiety, but with a quiet confidence. The road was unpredictable, but the larder was steady. A full larder was a promise to the traveler and to himself. Whatever the world throws at us, we will eat, we will be warm, we will rest. I think of the great earthenware jars themselves, shapes that had been perfected over centuries, long before the royal road was carved through the mountains. A jar for oil, a jar for wine, a jar for grain, each with its own proportions, its own lip and handle and base. The potters who made them were artists in their own right, and their vessels traveled the same roads as the merchants and couriers, packed into the panniers of 1,000 donkeys. The innkeeper would examine a new jar the way a musician examines an instrument, running his hand over the glaze, tapping it gently to hear its ring. A good jar would last for decades. A good jar would hold the memory of every meal it had ever contained, every loaf of bread, every cup of wine, every conversation at the long table. In this way, the innkeeper was surrounded by old friends. But let us not dwell too long in the larder. The inn itself demands our attention, for the building was as much a character in that story as any of the people who passed through it. The typical way station on the royal road was not a grand palace, not the lavish caravanserai of later centuries with its ornate gates and marble courtyards. It was a more modest thing, and all the more honest for it. 4 walls of sun-dried brick or stone, whitewashed inside to catch the light of the lamps. A flat roof of packed earth on wooden beams, where travelers could sleep in the summer months, looking up at a sky so full of stars that the constellations themselves seemed to be leaning in to listen. A courtyard with a well, or perhaps a cistern, the water drawn up cold and clean from the earth. A stable for the beasts, with mangers cut into the wall and rings set in the stone for tying ropes. And the main hall, the common room, where the life of the inn gathered itself. This room was the heart of the house, the hearth at one end, big enough to hold a log that would burn through the whole night. The long, low tables, worn smooth by the elbows of 1,000 travelers, stained with wine and soup and the marks of countless knives. The niches in the wall where lamps burned, their flames reflected in the glazed tiles behind them. And everywhere, the smell of people, of wool and sweat and wood smoke, and the lingering ghost of last night's dinner. It was not a smell that a traveler noticed as unpleasant, on the contrary. It was the smell of company, of the human world pressing close against the wild emptiness of the road. The innkeeper would move through this room as a ship moves through water, adjusting the draft of the fire, setting a fresh loaf within reach of an old man's hand, pouring a splash of wine into a cup that had gone empty without the traveler even noticing. He did not hustle or fuss. His movements were economical, almost lazy, the movements of a man who has done the same dance for 40 years and knows every step. A tilt of the jug here, a pushing of bread closer there. The travelers, tired as they were, absorbed this calm. They felt themselves settled, the way a bird settles on a branch, arranging its feathers before sleep. There is a tenderness in the way a good innkeeper treats his guests, not a false cheerfulness, not a loud and demanding geniality, but a quiet attention to the small signals of weariness and hunger and loneliness. A woman traveling alone, her face closed with fear, would find that her food was brought first, and that a seat was placed for her where she could keep her back to the wall and her eyes on the door. A young soldier, far from home and trying not to show, would find that the innkeeper had put an extra blanket on his mat, and that the old man by the fire had a story to tell, and the soldier would listen, and his shoulders would slowly come down. A merchant whose wares had been lost in the mountains, who had arrived with nothing but a dusty cloak and a story of disaster, would find that the innkeeper asked no questions, took his last coin with a nod, and still sent him off the next morning with bread in his pack and a cup of wine in his hand, because no one should face the world empty-handed. This was the unwritten law of the inn, older than the royal road itself. Hospitality was not a business transaction, or not only a business transaction, it was a sacred obligation, a thread that bound the people of the road together. The traveler, when he crossed the threshold, was no longer a stranger. He was a guest, and a guest had certain rights. He could expect that his horse would be fed and watered. He could expect a place by the fire, a roof over his head, a meal that would restore his strength. He could expect that his possessions would be safe while he slept, and that no one would ask too closely where he had come from or what he was carrying. In return, the guest was bound by his own obligations. He would not refuse to pay in the morning. He would not cause trouble in the house. He would not abuse the kindness that was offered him. And if he was a man of honor, he would remember the inn that had sheltered him and would speak well of it to others. And perhaps one day, when the road brought him back around, he would arrive with a gift, a small package of tea or a tin of sweets, a piece of news that the innkeeper would treasure for years. These were the small economics of the heart, a system of exchange that ran beneath the coins and the barter. The innkeeper was a merchant, yes, but he was also a keeper of the flame of civilization itself. And I do not mean that grandly. I mean it in the simplest, most literal way. His fire was the fire that travelers could count on. In a world without mobile phones, without weather forecasts, without navigation satellites, without any of the small miracles we now take for granted, the innkeeper's lamp was a fixed point in the swirling dark. The traveler would see it from a distance, a small warm blot of orange in the window, and the sight would be like the sudden release of a clenched fist inside his chest. He would hurry his step. He would whistle to his donkey to let it know that the day's journey was almost done. And when he reached the door and lifted the latch, he would be met not by a stranger, but by an old friend, even if he had never seen the innkeeper's face before. Now, I want to tell you a little about the travelers themselves, the ones who passed through the royal road in those far-off years, because the road was not a single thing. It was a river of human stories, each one distinct, each one making its own small path through the same landscape of mountains and valleys and stone-walled inns. The couriers, of course, are the ones we hear about most from the histories. We have the words of Herodotus, the Greek historian who traveled and wondered at the Persian system. He described the stations of the royal road with admiration, saying, "Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these swift couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds." It is a phrase that has survived for 2,500 years, and we still recognize it, though most of us do not know that it was written of the Persian post riders rather than our own letter carriers. Those couriers were the fastest men on earth. They would ride from station to station, each one carrying the royal message as if his life depended on it, because it did. The news might be of a victory or a rebellion, a decree or a death, and the speed with which it reached the far corners of the empire could decide the fate of thousands. But the couriers did not stop at the little inns to which I have been introducing you. They were riding, always riding, stopping at the official stations, the great caravanserais that had been raised by the king's own order, where a fresh horse was always ready, and where the messenger would dismount, hand his satchel to the next rider, and then collapse on a narrow bed, exhausted, to sleep until the world came to claim him again. The speed of the royal road was a marvel of the ancient world. The journey from Susa to Sardis, a distance of perhaps 1,500 miles, could be done in a week or so, and the numbers varied with the seasons and the state of the roads. Such speed was almost incomprehensible to the people of that time, and even to us today, it is something close to magic. The news of one city became the news of all cities within the span of a few days, and the empire held together because of that miracle of communication. And yet, when we think of the innkeepers, the ones I have been describing, they were not the ones serving the great riders. They served everyone else, and perhaps, in a quieter way, their contribution was just as essential. For the road was not only a channel for the king's commands. It was a live thing, a body that carried the lifeblood of the empire through all its veins. The merchants needed the road. The priests, the pilgrims, the families moving from one town to another, the wandering craftsmen and the traveling players, all of them needed the road, and all of them needed the inns that lined it like beads on a string. A traveler could walk the road for weeks, months, but if he timed his journey well, he would never have to spend a night in the open. There was always an inn within a day's walk, and at that inn, there was always a fire and a warm bowl of soup and a place, however humble, to lay down his head. The seasonal rhythm of the inn was tied to the rhythm of the road. In the spring, when the snows melted and the passes opened, the innkeeper would see the first trickle of travelers returning to the route. The road that had been silent for weeks would begin to fill with sound. The bell of a mule, the creak of cartwheels, the voices of people who had been shut in by the winter and were eager to move again. The innkeeper would welcome this trickle with joy, but also with caution. The road was still muddy in places, the rivers still high, and some travelers would arrive soaked and shivering and close to despair. He would take them in, dry them before the fire, feed them hot broth, and tell them in his calm way that the worst was over. And somehow his words would make it true. In the summer, the road would be at its busiest. The days were long, the countryside was green, and the market towns were holding their fairs. The inn would be full to bursting. Travelers would sleep in the courtyard, on the roof, in the hayloft above the stable, wherever there was a flat surface and a blanket. The innkeeper's wife would be kneading bread from before dawn until after midnight, her arms white with flour, her face glowing from the heat of the oven. The innkeeper's children would be running errands, fetching water from the well, carrying platters of food to the long tables, learning the craft of hospitality without even being aware that they were learning it. And at the height of the summer, when the road was thick with dust, the innkeeper would sometimes, and for no reason that he could explain, feel a deep and quiet joy. He would stand in the doorway of his inn, looking out at the road, and the road would seem to him like a great living river, and he, for this one night, would be its shore. He would be the place where the river met the land, where the moving world found its rest. The autumn brought a different mood. The leaves turned gold and red along the mountain passes, and the first chill crept into the air. The travelers were fewer now, but they came with a different purpose. The merchants were bringing their harvest goods to market, the last caravans of the year before the winter snows. The innkeeper would lay in his own stores, buying up grapes from the nearby vineyards, pressing his own small quantity of wine, bottling the last of the honey, smoking the meat that the farmers brought him in exchange for a place to stay. The air smelled of wood smoke and vinegar, and the sharp, sweet scent of apples, and the evenings were long, the fire roaring high in the hearth, the travelers leaning close to it with their cups in their hands, telling stories to pass the hours. In autumn, the stories were often of the past. The old men would talk about the winters they had survived, the roads they had walked when they were young, the innkeepers they had known, some generous, some mean, all of them now gone into the same ground. The innkeeper would listen to these stories, and he would recognize in them the same human thread that had been running through the world since before the road was built. And he would add his own stories to the mix, the tales of the ones who had passed through his door, and the tapestry would grow a little richer. The winter was the quiet time. The road would be empty for days, sometimes weeks, covered with snow that the wind would drift into dunes across the stones. The innkeeper would close his shutters early, bank the fire high, and retreat into the long nights of reading and repair. He would mend the harnesses, patch the roof, sharpen his knives, and listen to the wind howling around the eaves. Sometimes a traveler would still arrive, staggering in from the storm, half frozen, his beard full of ice. The innkeeper would run out to meet him, not because he expected payment, but because there was no other choice. You cannot leave a man to die in the snow, not when you have a fire and a hot meal and a spare blanket. You bring him in. You strip off his wet clothes. You wrap him in wool and put a warm stone at his feet. You feed him soup slowly, in small spoonfuls, until the color comes back to his face. And then you sit with him in the firelight, and you listen to where he has been and where he is going, and you wonder at the strange compulsion that drives men to the road even in the dead of winter. The compulsion of duty, perhaps, the compulsion of love, the compulsion of hunger, which is the strongest of all. In these winter nights, the innkeeper would think about the long history of which he was a part. He would think about all the innkeepers who had come before him, the ones who had kept the boil on the road, since the first kings had decided that the world needed a line through the wilderness. He would think about the shaping of the earth itself, the mountains that had stood there for millions of years, the streams that had carved their way through the valleys long before any human had given them a name. And he would feel a sense of his place in things, the same sense a lighthouse keeper feels, a sense of smallness and significance at once. He was not the road. He was not the mountains. He was only a man in a small room in a vast night. But he was a man with a fire, and the fire made all the difference. There's a story I have always loved about the ancient Persians and their notion of hospitality. I am not sure how true it is, and I will not speak as if I were certain, but it captures something essential, and I would like to share it with you. It is said that the king, when he traveled in disguise through his own domains, would sometimes stop at a humble inn and ask for a bowl of soup and a place to sleep. He did not reveal himself. He took his place at the long table with the other travelers, listened to their talk, observed their manners, and paid his small sum like any other guest. And the innkeeper, unaware of the royal presence, would treat him with the same hospitality he offered everyone. Not too much, not too little. A warm welcome, a filling meal, a clean mat, and a kind word in the morning. And this, the story says, was the test of a good innkeeper. The king could have walked into any palace and been received with ceremony and trembling. But that would have told him nothing. What mattered was whether the innkeeper would be generous when he thought no one important was watching, when his guest was just a dusty stranger in a colorless cloak, a man without rank or title or even a decent horse. And if the innkeeper passed the test, the king would reveal himself and would bestow on the innkeeper a gift that was fit for a king, a purse of gold, a fine horse, a hold on land that would make his family secure for generations. But if the innkeeper failed the test, well, we do not need to imagine the consequences. The story takes our attention away from that and lets us dwell instead on the quiet fantasy of goodness being rewarded. I like this story not for its morality lesson, which is simple enough, but for its image of the king as a traveler. For the king, the road must have been a strange and lonely place. He was surrounded by attendants, guarded by soldiers, cushioned against the roughness of the world. But beneath the royal robes, he was the same flesh and blood as his subjects. He knew hunger and weariness and the deep desire to sit down, unfasten his shoes, and let someone else worry about the state of the world for a little while. And perhaps when he sat at the innkeeper's table, the king tasted his soup and thought, "This is what it means to be a guest, to be welcomed not because of who I am, but because I am here, and that is enough." And perhaps in that small bowl of soup, the king understood himself a little better, and understood the people over whom he ruled a little better too. And that, I think, is the real magic of the inn. It does not care about rank or title. It does not ask for credentials. It only asks, will you sit with us and share our fire and be for one night a member of our household? The traveler who passed through those inns must have carried their memories with him for the rest of his life. How could he not? When you have walked for 30 miles in the heat and the dust, when your feet are blistered and your water skin is dry, when the sun is sinking behind the western mountains, and you have begun to wonder whether you will have to sleep in the open, then the sight of a light in a window is the most beautiful thing in all the world. And the hand that opens the door, the hand that takes your pack and sets it down, the hand that pours you a cup of water, that hand becomes holy to you. The traveler would lie on his mat that night, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of smoke and wool and other sleepers, and he would listen to the sounds of the inn, the crackle of the fire, the mutter of a child in its sleep, the snoring of the old man in the corner, the steady drip of water from the eaves. And he would think, I am safe. I am safe. I am safe. And that thought, repeated 3 times in the dark, would carry him into sleep, and his dreams would be of home, or of the home he meant to make, and the road would seem less terrible for having brought him here. The fears of ancient travelers were not so different from our own, I think, when we strip away the centuries. They feared being alone. They feared being robbed, losing everything they owned, being left destitute by the side of the road. They feared illness, the sudden fever, or the wound that would not heal, with 100 miles still to cover, and no one to care for them. They feared the animals of the wild places, the wolves and the leopards and the snakes, and perhaps, more than the animals, they feared the wildness of the land itself, the narrow passes with their sheer drops, the rivers that could swell without warning, the storms that could trap a traveler for days in a mountain hollow. And they feared, as we all fear, the unknown, the country that stretched beyond the horizon, the languages they did not speak, the customs they did not understand. A traveler in ancient Persia might be a long way from home, and the miles in between were filled not only with distance, but with strangeness. This is why the inn was so much more than a place to sleep. It was a small colony of the known, set down in the middle of the unknown. It was home made portable, a piece of one's own world carried forward. When the traveler crossed the threshold, he left behind the wild road and entered the human world of manners and rules and comfort. And he knew, with a certainty that did not need words, that the innkeeper was on his side. Whatever dangers walked the night outside, within these walls, the covenant of hospitality held firm. I often wonder what the travelers talked about in the long evenings of those way stations. We can guess, perhaps, from the old stories and the travelers' tales that have come down to us, the same stories that any people tell around any fire. They would have exchanged information about the road ahead, the condition of the bridges, the presence of bandits, the weather that was coming down from the mountains. This was practical, essential talk, and the innkeeper would have stored it away in his memory, a living map of the road that was always being updated by the whispers of his guests. But they would also have told stories of a different kind, stories that had no practical use at all. They would have told myths and legends, the old tales of gods and heroes. They might have told stories about the kings of Persia, the glory of Cyrus, and the wisdom of Darius, the vast battles and the grand palaces. They would have told ghost stories, the kind that make the listeners glance nervously at the dark windows and then laugh, a little too loudly, to show that they are not afraid. And they would have told the stories of their own lives, each traveler the hero of his own tale, each one letting a little more of himself come out with each cup of wine, until the innkeeper, who had heard 1,000 such stories, could sit in his corner and see the whole of human nature unfolding before him like a great scroll. There was an old tradition, one that is said to have come down from the first peoples of the plateau, that the stories told at night would live in the building. The walls would absorb them, the beams would remember them, and the next traveler who slept in that room would dream of them. My grandfather told me something like that long ago, when I was a child and afraid of the dark. He said that the house knows everything that has ever been spoken within its walls, and that the silences are just the stories waiting for someone to begin them again. I think of this when I imagine the inns of the Royal Road. Those old walls, those whitewashed beams, those worn stones must have been heavy with the weight of all the words that had been spoken and dreamed and whispered within them. And the innkeeper, sleeping in his chamber above the common room, would be the keeper of those words. He would not remember them all, and perhaps he would not even hear them clearly, but he would feel them, the way one feels the presence of a crowd when one is blindfolded, the stirring of many lives breathing in the same air. You are listening to me now, here in your own quiet room, and perhaps you are drifting a little. The hour is late, and the day has been long, and my voice is a steady thing, low and warm, that asks nothing of you, but that you stay with me a little longer. I want to take you, just once, inside one of these inns. I want you to feel the way the floor gives a little under your feet, the packed earth worn smooth by generations of sandals. I want you to smell the smoke in your hair, that particular smell that clings to clothes after an evening by the fire, acrid and sweet at once. The smell of 1,000 woods that have been burned to keep 1,000 travelers warm. I want you to hear the sounds, the low murmur of the other guests, the clatter of pots in the kitchen, the wind testing the shutters, the unidentifiable sounds of animals settling in the stable, the creak of the rafters above you, the soft hiss of water boiling for tea. And I want you to feel the comfort of it, the deep animal comfort of being inside when the night is outside, of having a roof above your head and a wall at your back, of being enclosed in a small pocket of safety within the vast indifference of the world. This is the comfort that the innkeeper offered, and it is one that our own world still offers. Every time we lock a door or pull a blanket up to our chins, the shapes change, but the feeling is ancient as the first time a human being crawled into a cave and dragged a branch across the entrance to keep the night at bay for a few more hours. The innkeeper, for his part, felt this comfort too. He was not a traveler. He did not need to be sheltered from the road because he was already shelter. But he needed the travelers more than they needed him, if the accounting is done truly. Without them, he was just a man in an empty building, a keeper of a fire that warmed no one. The arrival of a guest, even a difficult one, gave purpose to the meal and the fire and the waiting breath of the house. It is a strange and beautiful thing, this mutual need. The guest needs the shelter. The host needs the guest. Neither is complete without the other, and in the meeting for one night, both become whole. There's a Persian word that I have always loved, and I want to share it with you, though I will not trouble you with its exact pronunciation. The word is Maimandari, and it means something like hospitality, but with a deeper weight. It carries the sense of the guest as a sacred trust, the host as a guardian, and the relationship between them as a bond that is not broken at sunrise. When the traveler leaves the inn, he does not simply pay his bill and walk away. He carries the host's honor with him, and the host carries the traveler's story inside himself, and the connection, thin as a thread, remains stretched across the miles. If the traveler comes to harm later on the road, the host, in some sense, shares in that harm. If the traveler succeeds, the host shares in the success. The guest was a gift, the hospitality was a promise, and the promise held as long as the memory held, and the memory could hold for a very long time indeed. I would like now to tell you a small story of my own imagining about one particular night at one particular inn on the Royal Road. It is not a story from any book. I cannot give you the name of the inn or the name of the innkeeper. The details have been worn smooth, the way the stones of the road were worn smooth by the passage of too many feet. But I think the shape of the story is true, and I hope you will allow me to tell it to you as the night deepens and your eyes grow heavy. The inn was a small one, a day's walk from the nearest town, set in a valley where the road ran alongside a river. There were willows along the bank, and the water made a sound that was like a long whisper, continuous and soothing. The innkeeper was a man of middle years, with a face that had been weathered by the wind, and a manner that was so quiet that some travelers mistook it for coldness. They did not know that he had been tending that inn for 20 years, that he had buried his wife beneath the old walnut tree in the courtyard, that he had raised his 3 children in the 2 small rooms behind the kitchen, that he had seen the road change from a rough track to a proper highway, and that his heart had become as steady as the stone walls of his house, only because it had been worn and worn and worn again. On this particular night, the inn was nearly empty. Just one guest, a young man who had arrived as the evening meal was being cleared away, too late for the stew and too early for the morning bread. He had not asked for food. He had not even asked for a bed. He had only stood in the doorway, swaying slightly, and looked at the innkeeper with an expression that was exhausted and hungry and somehow ashamed. The innkeeper had looked at him and had seen the dust and the torn sleeve and the bruises on the young man's hands, and had not asked a single question. He had simply led him to the common room, set a bowl before him of bread and cheese and olives, poured a cup of wine, and then gone about his business as if it were the most normal thing in the world. The young man ate slowly, then faster, then with a sudden desperate hunger that emptied the bowl and left him staring at the crumbs. He drank the wine and held the cup in both hands, letting the warmth of the earthenware soak into his palms. And then, without looking up, he said quietly that he had come from the mountains, that he had been with a caravan that had been struck by a storm, that the beasts had scattered, that several men had been lost, that he had walked for 2 days without food or shelter, and that he did not know what he could offer in payment. The innkeeper had been sweeping the floor. He stopped, leaned the broom against the wall, and came and sat down across from the young man. He looked at him for a long moment, and then he said, "The guest is the gift. That is all." He said it simply, as if it were not a proverb, but a fact of nature, like the wetness of the river or the greenness of the willow leaves. The young man looked at him, and his eyes filled with tears, and he did not try to hide them. The innkeeper did not look away either. He let the tears come. He waited, and when the young man had wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, the innkeeper stood, picked up the broom again, and said, "There is a mat by the fire. You will be warm. The morning will not be so bad." The young man slept, and the innkeeper did not sleep, not at first. He sat in his chair as the fire burned down, and he thought about all the travelers he had taken in over the years, and all the ones he could not help, and all the ones who had passed through his door and vanished into the dark, leaving behind only the trace of their feet on the stone floor. He thought about the young man's tears, and how they were no different from the tears he had seen 100 times before, the tears of a man who has been stripped of everything and has finally allowed himself to feel it. And he thought about the road, and how it kept giving him these moments, these small encounters with the brokenness and the resilience of the human spirit. He had not asked for any of this. He had only built a fire and set out bread and ole in, and the road had done the rest. The road and the hunger of the travelers, and the need that was in all of them to be welcomed just once, without having to explain themselves. In the morning, the young man was gone. The mat by the fire was folded neatly. The bowl and the cup had been washed and put back in their place, and on the table there was a small carved piece of wood, a bird with its wings half open, shaped so carefully that the innkeeper could feel the roughness of the fingers that had carved it. He picked it up and held it in his hand, and he felt something shift in his chest, something that was close to joy and close to grief. He put the bird on the ledge above the hearth, where he could see it as he went about his work. And he never saw the young man again, nor heard what became of him, nor had any way of knowing whether he had reached the place he was going. But the bird remained there, year after year, a small witness to the covenant that had been kept between them. And when the innkeeper himself died, many years later, the bird was still on the ledge, and his children divided his few belongings among themselves, and no one knew what the bird was, but they could not bring themselves to throw it away. So it stayed, gathering dust, its wing half open, until one day a strong gust of wind and a clumsy elbow sent it to the floor, where it broke into 2 pieces, and the pieces were swept up with the dust, and the memory of the moment slowly faded from the world. And yet, I think, the moment itself did not fade. It lodged somewhere in the heart of the innkeeper, and in the heart of the young traveler, and in the walls of the inn that had absorbed it, and in the river that had carried its whisper downstream, and in the planet that turned beneath it, all indifferent, but somehow containing it, the way a stone contains the imprint of a leaf from a tree that no longer exists. This, to me, is the true history of the royal road. It is not the history of kings and conquests, though those are there to be found if you look. It is the history of the nights, the small acts, the cups of wine set down in front of strangers, the doors left unbarred, the fires kept burning through the long dark hours. It is a history that was not written down because the people who lived it had no time to write and no need to do so. They passed it on in other ways. In the way a father taught his son to judge a traveler's need by the look in his eye. In the way a mother taught her daughter to pour the tea without slopping it. In the way a whole village understood that the man who robbed a guest was worse than a murderer, because the murderer at least killed the body, while the robber killed the faith that held the world together. We are a long way from those inns now. We are a long way in time, and a long way in the texture of our days. We do not need to walk 100 miles to find a bed, or to worry about being caught in the mountains when the snow falls. And yet, when I close my eyes and let my mind return to that road, to those old walls and those worn stones and those low tables, I feel a longing that I cannot quite put into words. It is a longing for simplicity, perhaps, for a world where the obligations were clear and the rewards were warm and visible. Or it is a longing for that particular kind of safety, the safety that comes from being enclosed in a small human space within a vast and indifferent universe. Or it is a longing for the connection itself, the simple and profound meeting of one person's need with another person's care. I think we all carry this longing with us, even if we do not name it. Our modern inns are built on the same principle, though they are taller and brighter and more anonymous than their ancestors. But when we check into a hotel, even a beautiful one, and the attendant hands us a key and points us toward an elevator, there is something that is not quite the same. We do not come down to a common room with a fire and a bowl of soup and a conversation with a stranger. We do not lie on our mats and listen to the sounds of other human lives around us through the thin walls. We are given our privacy, and privacy is a kind of comfort, but it is also a kind of loneliness. And when the night presses in around us, and the unfamiliar noises of the building echo in our ears, we may occasionally find ourselves imagining what it would be like to hear the snap of logs in the hearth, and the low murmur of the innkeeper's voice, and to be told, in a plain and unassuming way, that the morning will not be so bad. There was something about the old hospitality that our own age has forgotten, and I am not sure if we can ever get it back. We have made the world too wide, too fast, too full of strangers to be able to treat them all as guests. And yet, at our best, we still try. We still offer a cup of tea to a neighbor in sorrow. We still give a ride to a stranger caught in the rain. We still open our homes for the holidays and gather around the table and pass the food and the stories back and forth. And for a few hours, we are not so different from the innkeeper and his guests. The names have changed, the road is different, but the fire is the same. And I think, as long as that fire is burning, the spirit of the royal road is not entirely lost to us. It has simply found new inns, new ways of sheltering the weary, And if we pay attention, we can catch a glimpse of it in our own small acts of welcome, our own brief moments of meeting the eyes of a stranger and knowing, without a word, that they are tired and we are warm, and there is room for both of us. And now, the hour is growing late, and the fire in your own room is burning low, and I can feel in the shape of my own voice that the night is ready to take over. Perhaps you have let your eyes close without realizing it. Perhaps the book has fallen from your hands, or your head has dropped gently toward your shoulder. That is all right. The road you are traveling tonight is not the royal road of Persia, but it is a road all the same, and it will carry you to the same place it has carried every traveler since the beginning of time. To the little room where you lay down your head, and the blanket is warm, and the world outside can wait until morning. I will leave you at the door of your own inn, as it were, and I will let the sound of my voice fade away like the embers of a fire that is no longer needed. You can stay here, in the warm chamber of the story, as long as you like. There is no hurry. The road will still be there in the morning, and the innkeeper will still be there, standing in his doorway, watching the dust rise in the light, wondering what new traveler the day will bring. And so, as we come to rest, let me leave you with this final image, one that I have carried with me for as long as I can remember. It is the image of the inn itself, seen from a little distance, as night falls over the valley. The walls are low and white, and the roof is flat, and the smoke rises straight up into the cold air, because there is no wind tonight. The door is open, and the light from the fire spills out across the threshold in a warm golden rectangle. A figure is in the doorway, barely visible, a silhouette against the light. He is not moving. He is just standing there, looking out at the road and the darkening mountains, waiting, as he has waited every night for as long as anyone can remember. And behind him, inside, there is the sound of a kettle, and the murmur of voices, and the sweet and sleepy smell of bread. Night is enormous, and the mountains are old, and the road is long. But there is this small place, and it is warm, and it is open, and the door is not locked. And that, perhaps, is all we ever really need to know about the Persian royal road and the innkeepers who sheltered its travelers. You can drift now. Let the image fade, let the sound soften, let the weight of the day slide off your shoulders like a heavy cloak. You have walked far, but you have arrived. And the morning will not be so bad, I promise you. It will come softly, the way mornings have come since the first dawn, washing over the mountains and the valleys and the old white walls of the inn. And you will wake to it, rested and ready, and carrying within you the warmth of that ancient fire. It is a good thing to be a traveler, and it is a good thing to be a guest, and it is a good thing, above all, to belong to that long caravan of souls who have found shelter under someone else's roof, and who will one day, if you are lucky, open their own door to a stranger in the dark. Sleep well. The road is quiet tonight, and the innkeeper is watching, and he will keep the fire burning until the sun returns. There's nothing more he needs to do, and there is nothing more you need to do either. You are safe, and you are warm, and the story has come to its rest. So let it go. Let all of it go. Let the dust settle, and the voices fade, and the last lamp be blown out, and the deep and simple peace of the night wash over you, the same peace that the traveler felt lying on his mat by the fire 1,000 years ago, 1,000 miles away, and knowing in the deepest part of himself that for this one night there was nothing to fear. That is the gift that the innkeepers gave to the road. That is the gift that remains theirs even now. And it is yours too. It has always been yours. You just had to rest a little to remember it.